Zelensky and the Ukrainians, they think we can win this war,
Yeah.
right? But that depends on NATO being willing to continue to supply them with the weapons to do that. And she said to Putin, we are going to change the world order in a way it hasn't been changed for 100 years. Those are ominous words to anybody in a liberal democracy. Putin's a thug, but he's not stupid. And I said in a recent interview, I'm happy to be corrected. He's stupid.
Today, we bring you a special analysis episode looking into Ukraine, Russia, and what it may mean for Australia as we consider our future living under the shadow of China. My guest is Dr. Paul Monk. Paul has a doctorate in history and international relations, worked for the Defence Force as an intelligence analyst specialising in China, and today consults on critical thinking and decision-making, including being engaged by the Australian Defence Force to review their decision-making processes in relation to major weapons acquisitions. Paul has a deep knowledge of geopolitics, including the situation in Ukraine, internally in Russia, the implications of that for China, and of course Australia, and he's joining me right now on the Aussie Wire for this special analysis episode. My guest, Dr. Paul Monk, welcome and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this open wire, as it were, exercising our freedom of speech.
Yes, indeed. No, and I do appreciate your support. Look, you reminded me just before we began recording that not everyone necessarily follows the news and what's happening, and that's probably a healthy thing, to be honest. I think we could all do with a little bit less of following of the minutiae of the day-to-day news. But for those that are coming into this a little bit blind, could you paint a broad sweep of what's happening in Ukraine now? The war's been going on for over a year. On one side, you've got fearmongers saying it's going to be the end of the world. On another side, you've got Russian boosters and supporters saying that Putin's right. You've got people saying that Zelensky's right. And you've got all kinds of noise in the middle. Let's pull all of that out and just have a look at what's the reality of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine at the moment.
Well, before we get to any details about what's happening on the ground right now, let's briefly, for those listeners to whom you just referred, paint the broad brush picture, which is that Ukraine was, of course, openly invaded just over a year ago, 15 months ago. And on the eve of that invasion, I was one of those, and President Zelensky in Ukraine was another. The French and German leaders were among others, very skeptical that Putin would do this. The belief was surely he wouldn't be so rash as to try and take the whole country, but that's what he tried to do. And we're all aware that, of course, it failed rather abysmally. And it does appear that one of the reasons for that is that Putin, first of all, kept the operation secretive. So very few people knew what he was planning, except the CIA, who warned Zelensky, and Berlin and Paris, who nevertheless said, we don't believe you. But the CIA had it right. But also, he believed his own propaganda, and he had told his soldiers, you'll be welcome with flowers, you'll just march in. So they took 3 days' rations, and they didn't expect to meet armed resistance, and they met a lot of armed resistance, and things came apart. So that's the jump-off point for the war. Before venturing into how things have gone since then, it's very important, of course, to sketch in the deeper historical background, which is that though people may have heard variations on this theme, Ukrainian nationalism is not something that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has deep roots and a long history. And whereas Putin has claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are really one people, even if there was more truth to that than there is, he has now entrenched Ukrainian nationalism as almost nothing else could have done. That's been a debacle from his point of view. But on Ukrainian nationalism, it goes back a very long way, but it's a complex picture. Ukraine is a territory that has over many centuries been divided in several different ways. And it's really very interesting that nationalism has survived and come to the surface in Ukraine after it had been part of the Soviet Union and prior to that the Russian Empire for a significant period of time. What's very interesting, however, is that Ukrainian and Russian are different in the same way that, roughly speaking, say German and Dutch are different. They're obviously related, but they are different. And there is a history in Ukraine of wanting to be able to govern their own affairs. And the really significant jump off point from that point of view, in the prehistory of this war, is that in 1991, when the Ukrainian Rada had the opportunity to vote on do they want an independent Ukraine or to
Mm.
remain part of a larger federation, they voted overwhelmingly for independence.
Yeah.
Um, Now we can discuss why they should have done or perhaps shouldn't have done. I mean, none other than George Bush Sr. pleaded with them not to do this. He said, please remain part of the same political unity, because he believed that he was getting on well with Gorbachev,
Mm.
and that between them they could manage a transition that would leave a stable nation state of some kind in
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainians voted otherwise, and you might say the rest is history. We could come back to aspects of that if you wish, but
Mm.
the war got underway, and whereas Putin manifestly thought that he could decapitate the regime, and he had hitchbloods in Kiev whose purpose was to assassinate Zelensky and other
Mm-hmm.
leaders, that all failed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a striking story in itself. And there was a joke that did the rounds a few months ago, which Ukrainian soldiers apparently had been sharing, which is that we used to think the Russian military was the second best army in the world. Now we know it's the second best army in Ukraine.
Yes. Well, and this is one of the astonishing sort of sidebars in all of this. And, amongst my viewers, there's a plurality of views, and there are many people, there is a significant minority of people who would be supporting Putin and saying, oh, he's the good guy, he's, NATO have done the wrong thing, CIA have done the wrong thing in Ukraine, etc. I've said from the beginning, don't look for good guys in this particular conflict. This is an armed conflict between the most corrupt country in Europe, known for sex trafficking, arms dealing, international large-scale money laundering, funding of terrorism, all sorts of things. It's a fight between them and Russia. These are both countries that have deeply seated corruption, and we see that going right up to the highest levels of the US government now in the form of Hunter Biden and some of those revelations. So I'm not here to say that there's a good guy necessarily in this fight, but I agree with your assessment that this was an open invasion, and they were clearly not welcomed by the people of Ukraine. The clearest metric possible is that the people of Ukraine lined up to get weapons and fight, not with flowers and flags to welcome the arriving Russians. And that there pretty much tells me everything that I need to know. So coming in the picture a little bit now, we're in a situation where there's been not a stalemate, but certainly the battle lines have been much more slowly moving. The assault on Ukraine failed, as you said, Kiev failed, as you said, and that was abandoned long ago. We're now talking about battlefields well away from the capital city of Kiev, although there are missiles being fired and drones being used, etc. there. We'll touch on that a little bit later. What has this war evolved into now?
Well, the simplest way to answer that question would be to say that more or less from day one, or at least from about day 7, when it was clear that the attack on Kiev had failed, Zelensky became a Churchillian figure in Ukraine. He spoke out remarkably lucidly and courageously, and he really rallied Ukraine people behind him. And he said, we are not surrendering any Ukrainian territory. What they've taken, we're going to take back.
Yeah.
And it took months before they went on the counteroffensive. But they marshaled their forces well, they used them well, and they pushed the Russians back. They retook Kharkiv, they retook Kherson, they retook parts of Donbass, and they exhibited a capacity as well as a willingness to fight that you were not seeing on the Russian side. And indeed, the latest reports are that thousands of Russian soldiers who are unwilling conscripts and badly trained, if not untrained, have been looking to surrender. They don't want to fight it.
Yeah.
So the state of play at the moment is Putin has got himself into a war that he would have been very much better off without.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear what his off-ramp is.
Well, this is the great concern now, because without an off-ramp that at least involves some level of saving face for him politically, at least internally, if his off-ramp involves him losing power in Russia, then he's not going to take that off-ramp. And that leads us to some potentially fairly scary places. And without wanting to join the fear-mongering, because there's a lot of nonsense that does get said, we are seeing a little bit of saber rattling from those within the senior Russian military about nuclear weapons. And this has been happening on and off all the way through. This is a common and old tactic. But it is notable to me that we've just recently seen Russian generals coming out saying that Russia need to move nuclear weapons into Belarus as a preemptive move to stop NATO from moving nuclear weapons into Ukraine. that strikes me as a frankly absurd assessment of the situation. Can you help me unpack what's going on? Why would Russia be saying something that is so fanciful?
Well, the truth is that from Putin down, those who have been orchestrating and running this war, um, including major pro-Kremlin media figures, have made many outlandish statements.
Mm.
And as a consequence, and this was true even before the war actually began, I made the remark on TV a few days before the invasion, and I said that much of what is being said has surely to be interpreted as bluff. It's an attempt to ensure that NATO will go to war and Putin can have his way,
Yeah.
right? And when you see it continue to happen after 15 months, you think it's hard to put it all down to bluff. I think that it does reflect the mentality of quite a few of these people,
Mm.
which of course is rather worrying because it means that they're not thinking coherently. They've fought this war in a shambolic way.
Yeah.
They're thinking in a shambolic way. And that's actually more dangerous than if we understood exactly how they're thinking, even if we disagreed with them.
Well, this I think is exactly the point now, and this is a point that people like Dr. Humphreys were making to me some time ago, and you've made as well. A resolution that involves Putin losing power in Russia is both dangerous and messy and unlikely. That's not both. That's three things. It's dangerous, it's messy, and it's unlikely. And so, therefore, as much as there are people who would like to say otherwise, some sort of a negotiated settlement is realistically the only way we're likely to see this end without it becoming an absolute horror show first. So what does that negotiated settlement look like? What are the off-ramps that you think are actually available to Putin that he might actually consider?
Well, there are two sides to this coin. So the first is that you were saying that Putin would not likely accept humiliation or accept the danger of him being overthrown
Mm.
domestically, and therefore somehow you need a face-saving measure. The other is that on the back of early resilience and subsequent battlefield success, Zelensky and the Ukrainians are, pardon the expression, feeling rather bolshy.
Hmm.
Right? They think we can win this war,
Yeah,
right? But that depends on NATO being willing to continue to supply them with the weapons to do that,
sure.
right? And for months in the early phase of the war, Berlin and Paris in particular were hoping that Putin could be persuaded to moderate his claims, that the Ukrainians would accept what they saw as battlefield realities, which is the Russians could never be dislodged
Sure.
from the Donbass or Crimea, and that Zelensky should negotiate on that basis. But they came around to the view that Putin couldn't be negotiated with.
Yeah,
And so they then threw their support behind Zelensky.
yeah.
So the situation now is one has to think very hard, as you rightly point out, about the possibility of a regime crisis. And
Mm.
none other than Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the mercenary commander of the Wagner Group
Hmm.
and a very dodgy character in his own right, has said recently, revolution is coming in Russia.
Yeah.
Now, what would such a man mean by revolution? He doesn't mean a liberal democratic revolution.
No.
I think he means a fascist revolution.
Well,
And this right, this means very interesting, or taps into a very interesting aspect of the Putin regime, which is that in order to consolidate an otherwise illegitimate and dodgy rule
mm,
under United Russia, his party, Putin has played on every kind of nationalism that he can
yeah.
at the expense of liberal Democrats. And that includes neo-fascist and neo-Nazi groups
Hmm.
in Russia.
Hmm.
And it's those people who would be most likely spoiling for a revolution, right? Prigozhin is, I would say, to Putin very roughly um, what the and now my memory's going to betray me, the leader of the brown shirts was to Hitler in
Yeah.
1934.
Yeah.
And the Wagner Group might be compared with the brown shirts. Like it's a rough analogy, but
Mm.
um, uh, it's not often that a name eludes me. The key thing was, of course, that Hitler decided a year or so into having become chancellor that the brown shirts were a problem.
Yeah.
If he was going to consolidate power and get the support of the industrial and financial elites, he
Yeah.
needed to get rid of them. And so in the night of the long nights, he had about 1,000 of them killed
Hmm.
and integrated the brown shirts, such as they were, into the SS under firm party control.
Yeah.
Whether Putin could do something similar and hold the line, I honestly don't know at this juncture. And you know, in what way would he rationalize what he was doing?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Stalin used to do this kind of thing. He would unleash havoc and then blame party functionaries for excesses and purge them. And
Yeah.
right. But Putin's not Stalin at the end of the
Mm.
day.
Mm.
He's got a far more limited and spotty hold on power.
Mm.
So to come back to your core question, though,
Mm.
if one is to approach him and say, look, you weren't willing to compromise 6 months, 9 months, 15 months ago. Surely now it's time to talk sense,
Mm.
geopolitical sense.
Mm.
Henry Kissinger would say this. If he's 100 years old now, Henry, and he's saying, we need to talk pragmatics and
Mm.
geopolitics, balance of power, because if
Mm.
we get too carried away with righteousness, this gets out of control.
Well,
Um,
I,
but let me emphasize
mm.
that Putin has thus far shown a marked unwillingness to negotiate any terms other than basically dictating the settlement.
Yeah.
And he's not in a position now to dictate the settlement.
No.
And moreover, those who most wanted to talk to him have long since thrown their support behind Zelensky. So
Yeah.
we're at a very interesting point in the war. And I would have thought, to be honest, that at this stage, um, it's important to do two things: to demonstrate, if it needs further demonstration, that the Ukrainians can push Putin out of Ukraine,
Mm.
as it was in 1991 to 94, but that they will not invade Russia. But
Sure.
to add on to that, that what is wanted by the rest of Europe and by Ukraine, if only it could be arranged with Putin and his crown, is a workable, amicable trading relationship with
Yeah.
a civilized Russia. Nobody wants a war with Russia.
Yeah.
Nobody's trying to destroy Russia. But his paranoid nationalism has kept insisting that the West is against Russia, that Ukraine is run by Nazis, which
Yeah.
is just balderdash, and Zelensky's Jewish, as everybody now knows,
Yeah.
and lost family members in the Holocaust, And so you somehow need to penetrate the circle of sycophants and paranoiacs around Putin
Yeah.
and say, can you talk about this? And I'm not sure that can be done. So we are in dicey territory.
Well, it's awfully fraught, and the off ramp to me is terribly unclear, and it seems that it's not any clearer in your mind either. You mentioned the supply of weapons, the fact that Ukraine obviously they clearly have the courage, the will to fight. They didn't welcome the invaders with flowers, as we've touched on. They've put up an incredible resistance and somewhat belatedly began to receive arms shipments and support from various NATO militaries. We've seen that escalate recently with the US now agreeing to the supply of used F-16 fighter jets, fourth generation fighter jets, into Ukraine, which are very much a match for most of what Russia has to offer in their air force. Pardon me. But require an enormous amount of training. You can't just get a pilot from Soviet era, fighter jets and just stick him in a F-16 and away they go.
Yeah.
So this indicates not only an enormous financial commitment, but also a longer term view of the expectation of how this is likely to play out. Can you talk me through some of the implications? You're someone who understands these expensive weapon systems and the timelines involved, etc. What does it say to you that Ukraine wants these, and that the US and NATO countries have now agreed to supply them? What does that say about their frame of mind?
Well, Zelensky said more or less on day one, I don't need a ticket out. I need arms, right?
Yeah.
And above all, what I want is NATO air power, right, to protect our cities,
Yeah.
to prevent the Russians from asserting air supremacy. Now, for some strange reason, the Russians failed to assert air supremacy anyway.
Quite astonishing, right? But yes, that's another story.
Yeah. And what happened in the first, quite long phase of the war was that air-to-air missiles and various other munitions were able quite effectively to inflict costs on the Russians.
Mm.
And so, Zelensky wanted greater air power. He's now going to get some. What is that for? Well, it would be difficult to see this, let's say, if you're looking at it from the Kremlin's point of view, as anything other than equipping Zelensky to strike harder and deeper, right? And if that's the intention, then it's a correct perception. If it's not the intention, it's hard to know exactly.
It's quite dangerous.
It's dangerous if what one fears most is a wider war. On the other hand, if one believes, and it seems to me we're in dangerous territories, we agreed, but nevertheless, it's reasonable to assume that
Mm.
at the end of the day, like anybody else who's had nuclear weapons, the Russians will balk finally at using them for fear of what could follow.
Yeah.
Right? The Cuban Missile Crisis and other things were hair-raising experiences for those who remember them or have studied them.
Mm.
But both sides realised at every step we don't want to be the one who pulls out if we can avoid it, but we don't want nuclear war.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
are we going to do? And even Mao. I mean, Mao used to carry on about saying China could withstand an all-out nuclear assault by the United States because it would only kill a couple 100 million people, and he'd say, we've got another 500 or 600 million anyway. But when Eisenhower threatened to actually use nukes, he backed off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it seems to me, provided the message from NATO and from Washington is clear to Putin that NATO will not be using a first strike, will not be using nuclear weapons, but
Mm.
he really must not do so himself because there'll be hell to pay. And he ought to know that nobody's going to win that war. It's going to be a god awful mess.
Mm.
And so he needs to think calmly about a way to maneuver himself out of the hole he's dug himself into. But let me just say, with regard to F-16s,
Mm.
it isn't just a straight comparison of platforms with Russian fighters. On paper, Russia has some of the best fighter aircraft in the world,
Mm.
and it has had for generations. But a great deal has to do with command and control and need to say missile systems and so forth. And what demonstrated this as well as anything in post-war history is the Yom Kippur War, where the Syrians and Egyptians had Soviet jets, MiG-21s.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelis had Phantom F-4s, and the Israeli Air Force just shot the Syrian and Egyptian fighters out of the air like fish in a barrel. They just,
Yeah.
my recollection is that the Syrian Air Force lost 74 fighters to the Israelis one, right? In a short war. It was a massacre, and that wasn't because the platform was inferior. It was because the Israeli pilots and command and control were greatly superior. Now the question arises: the Ukrainians at the moment may or may not have command and control as elite as the Israelis did, but they'll get NATO training, and we've seen so far that NATO equipment has put the Ukrainians at a decided advantage on the battlefield.
For sure. One of the concerns that I have is the next step after saying, okay, we'll supply you with these incredibly sophisticated airborne weapons systems. That's what they are. Oh no, it's going to take us a very long time to retrain your pilots. Well, we'll just supply you with pilots for a little while. That toe in the water of actually now involving foreign nationals directly in the war, which has not happened much, if at all, in Ukraine thus far. It's what we saw in places like Vietnam and Korea, with Chinese actual nationals in Chinese equipment fighting on foreign soil against American nationals in American equipment.
And I should add Russian pilots in the Korean.
And Russian pilots, correct. And it feels as though we may well be creeping towards, another Korea, another Vietnam. These aren't wars that I think we want to be comparing any modern war to. They were incredibly wasteful and destructive and harmful in a lot of ways, and we're seeing that play out again in Ukraine. Is there a way, and I'm not sure that there is, this is a genuine question, is there a way for NATO to be the one that backs away first without that ultimately just meaning capitulating to Putin's demands? Is there an opportunity somewhere in all of this for NATO to sort of be the bigger guy and be the one that kind of offers the olive branch? And do you have any idea what that would even have to look like without just being a capitulation to, okay, you can keep Ukrainian territory, etc.?
It seems to me that there are two obstacles to that happening. One is that one of the most notable consequences of Putin launching the war that he did is not only did NATO come together as it had not done in a long time.
That's true.
Coordinated by Biden's Washington in a very adroit way, must be said. It was surprising given antecedents and the recent shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan. But with regard to Ukraine, they got their act together and they thought very well about it. They acted very well. They acted behind the scenes. They gave quiet warnings to Putin, which didn't work. And then, of course, when Putin did launch his war, you have the Swedes and the Finns, neutral for all this time, saying, we want in, we want to be a part of NATO. You had the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, well, the Hungarians were an anomalous case, the Poles, Czechs, Romanians, all saying, look, we're front line here. If Ukraine goes, we're next.
Yeah.
You have the Lithuanians, the Estonians,
Yep.
all saying the same. In other words, that Putin's desideratum of, and he openly called for this, of NATO to pull back to its 1997 lines,
Yeah.
has had, no effect. He's got the
Yeah.
opposite of what he sought.
Yeah.
All right. Is NATO now going to say, oh, look, in order to mollify you and soothe your feelings, we'll do what you requested in 1997? I don't think so.
No.
Are they going to say, look, we'll forgive and forget. So, yeah, you made a mess of Ukraine, but they'll have to suck it up? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Will they say, we're going to take the sanctions away so that you can all resume your kleptocratic ways, provided you pull out? I suspect they won't do that either. What they need to be able to say to Putin is, we are not the enemies of Russia. You have acted as if we were. What we want to talk to you about is a future for Russia that you and all Russians can regard with respect and dignity. And that's Russia, not Ukraine. It's not the old Russian Empire. It's Russia as a nation state among other nation states. Be part of the new post-Cold War order where everybody else is in, everybody else wanted to be in, including Ukraine, and you have been the standouts. Rethink that and we can get along.
Right.
But in the meantime, right, you've done so much damage in Ukraine, recklessly, heedlessly, terroristically, that can't be forgiven and forgotten. That Ukraine's going to have to be rebuilt, and you've suffered, other than casualties in the battlefield and material losses, you've suffered very little because nobody's been hitting your territory. Think about what that means.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that's, by way of answering your question, it's effectively saying it seems to me very implausible at this point that NATO would say, well, let's take a step back and make concessions.
Yeah. No.
And Zelensky, it seems to me, would be adamantly saying, I'm not for making concessions.
Sure. Sure.
We want reparations. It's almost like in the First World War, when it finished, you had Woodrow Wilson, who's come in as a victorious outsider and said, well, we should be generous to the Germans. And Clemenceau and Lloyd George say, you've got me.
Yeah. Look, your answer was coming through loud and clear. What I was hearing was, that's not going to happen. And for all the reasons that you described, that's reasonable, that's fair enough. But it's also tragic in the sense that it seems as though the only way out is that first both sides are going to get deeper in, and all of the suffering that is inevitably going to bring. In terms of Australia's involvement, we've sent some Bushmasters, we've done a few dribs and drabs here and there. Very little on a global scale, but quite a lot on a per capita scale. It's one of the things that Australia does. We're a bit player on the global scale, but we do tend to pull above our weight if you just look at population or even GDP, etc. It's very much not our war, but I almost get the feeling that within Australia there's almost a desire to make it our war. We want to kind of inject ourselves into that situation. Politicians over here, they want to be seen in Ukraine shaking Volodymyr Zelensky's hand. They want to be sending aid and these sorts of things. Is that a noble impulse that is in Australia's interest, do you think, or is that politics at work? Do you think it's in Australia's interest for us to have been even involved to the degree that we have?
I think the simplest answer to your question is I do, and for two reasons. The first is that we are, strictly speaking, in the international scheme of things, a country not unlike Ukraine. We're a middle power, we're a democracy. And the thing that Putin objects most to about Ukraine is the democratic revolution. It was the democratic revolution in 2014 which got rid of Yanukovych, who was his mayor. And put democracy on a firm footing in Ukraine, that consolidated the decision of Ukrainians to want both independence and democracy.
Yeah.
We respect that. And so it's more sympathy for Ukraine as a country than anti-Russian feeling as such on our part. The second is, of course, that we're in a situation at the moment in Asia where we're thinking, well, Xi Jinping is shaping up as the Putin of Asia, right? And he's got more clout than Putin. And we're concerned about what he might do. It's over the top to believe that some people talk this way, that the Chinese at any time in the foreseeable future are likely to attempt a continental invasion of Australia. But if they come to dominate Asia, if they have their way and the US pulls out of East Asia, pulls back to Hawaii essentially, then we lose a great deal of freedom of movement. And we've seen already in the last few years what that looks like with attempts by Beijing to bully us. So that's why we're exhibiting solidarity with Ukraine. We want a world order in which states don't get invaded, in
Yeah.
which they don't get bullied in this way. And it's always been difficult to arrange. And it's being challenged now by Xi and Putin. And Xi said to Putin, we're going to change the world order in a way it hasn't been changed for 100 years. Those are ominous words to anybody in a liberal democracy.
So on that, the BRICS alliance came together, and there was much noise and fury around that, and they're going to replace NATO and render all these other alliances obsolete. There is already indications of some fracturing there. Now, they could be teething issues and birthing pains of a new alliance, or it could just be that this is actually strange bedfellows and that they're just not actually, it's not going to work in the first place. I think it's notable. There's a notable absence of involvement of China in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We saw announcements where Xi Jinping came out and said that we have a partnership with no limits with Russia, and yet we haven't seen much in the way of material, maybe some ammunition and so forth. There'd be some oil and some other. There's certainly some transactions going back and forth, but to me at least, and correct me if you see it differently, it looks to me as though Xi is quite happy to let Putin kind of suffer a little bit. And does Xi, to my mind, is Xi looking at this as his opportunity to overtake Russia unquestionably? He probably already had, but to unquestionably take a seat at the table as the world's number 2 great superpower?
I think it's widely agreed, and was even before the war began, that that's essentially the state of play already. And Putin and those around him, Russian nationalists, aren't happy about that because they think, well, the Soviet Union was the number 2.
Yeah.
It should be the case. To which the answer would have to be, well, you screwed that up.
Good and proper.
Right? But I think also that Xi Jinping has several irons in the fire. And one of them is that he appears to have believed, when Putin talked about going in, that Putin could do what he claimed, that he could do a blitzkrieg and change the regime in Kiev. And had he been able to do that, Xi would have thought, well, that was easy, and NATO didn't do anything. So Taiwan's looking more attractive. But very quickly he realized, oh, that's not going according to plan.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we don't want to get burned here. We don't want to look bad by too openly supporting a guy who's losing, and we don't want to get drawn into a war. We've got other fish to fry.
Yeah.
And we can actually take advantage of Russia, because they have to sell their oil and gas, don't they? Well, we'll buy some of that at a steep discount, know. So I think that he's been exploiting the situation, but he's also been circumspect because it didn't play out the way he expected. And my understanding is that whereas the CIA evidently had very good sources inside Russia and very good surveillance, and so it knew exactly where Putin's sources were positioned in Russia and Belarus and where they were going to go and what the strategic plan was, and told Zelensky, and moreover was able to inform him of attempts, plans to assassinate him and help him to preempt those. That was very good use of strategic and tactical intelligence.
Yeah.
But the Chinese appear not to have had the same intelligence for some reason, and that's very interesting because we tend to credit the PRC with supernormal capabilities when it comes to intelligence and strategic thinking. And this is perhaps an illustration that not so much.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that hasn't received a lot of scrutiny. But as an old China head, I'm thinking that's actually very interesting.
I drink a brew coffee every morning because it's great coffee made easy. Brew is organic, specialty-grade coffee that is roasted, ground and sealed in individual servings right here in Australia. Perfect for the work site, for the campsite, for travellers on the flight deck or at home on the back deck. Brew, it's great coffee made easy. BrewAustralia.com. Use the code TAW10 for a 10% discount every time you buy. What I'm finding interesting is that Russia is now buying weapons and ammunition back from Iran. And this is very much a reversal. I mean, it's not even a case of the student having become the master. It's a case of the master having become destitute to the point that they're having to go back to the student. And obviously the Caspian Sea is there as a very convenient sea route. They can ship directly. They share a border effectively via the Caspian Sea. We know that NATO countries have been stretched at times in supplying ammunition, etc., to Ukraine. We know that this has been an incredibly high consumption war in terms of lives. The meat grinder aspect of it has been horrific, but also in terms of ammunition, missiles, and mortar shells, and all of that. How long before we start to see any? I mean, at this point, as best as I can tell, there don't appear to be serious shortages on the Russian side. They're still able to prosecute war very effectively in all of its destructive horror. When do we start to see these sanctions really take effect on the battlefield, or am I missing something? Are they already having an effect on the battlefield?
I think they've had an effect. One of the things, of course, that's difficult to assess, particularly, if we're, as we both are, outsiders at a, considerable distance,
Sure.
Is the way in which the Russian system, by inertial momentum, is absorbing or denying those costs.
Sure.
And clearly the Kremlin's propaganda encouraged Russians generally to believe that this was simply an operation that would be over quickly, and that it was denazifying Ukraine, and a lot of Russians, without any real source of information other than state propaganda, swallowed that line. But as time has gone on, and thousands of young Russian men have been killed or crippled or whatever, that is not good. The costs have been much higher than the Afghanistan war, and that helped to bring the Soviet Union down. And they've had to resort to all sorts of sleights of hand to try and get men into the field, including, Prigozhin's gone into prisons, into the Gulag and so on, and said, well, if you guys volunteer to fight, So I think that the strain has been considerable. And on the other hand, you mentioned the BRICS, and one thing that has helped Putin to at least persevere so far is that the BRICS didn't join NATO by and large in, imposing sanctions or opposing the war in quite the same way. And the most notable case is actually India. We think of India as part of the Quad, which it is, and we've had Modi here recently, and we have good relations with India. There's nothing that we currently need to fear about India as a power, but it's very ambivalent about Russia for historical reasons and for geopolitical reasons. So the world is a complex place, and certainly those countries, and Modi's India would be a good case in point, would want to see this thing settled with as little destructive after effect as possible. But that only brings us back to the question you asked earlier. If instead of me, one was asking Modi or his advisors, well, how is this to be settled? I'm sure they would say that NATO shouldn't try and push Putin over the brink. That's common sense in a way, right, in all the circumstances, but it doesn't get you very far in terms of, but what should it do? That's the thing for not do. And if the battlefield situation was, or if it became more of a stalemate, then it seems to me pressure would start to mount on Zelensky to say, look, in the interest of your own country, your own people, the geopolitical system, the global economy, we need you to find a way to come to terms with Putin, right? And Zelensky, of course, did make several such attempts, right? But Putin's demands were so exorbitant, and as far as I'm aware, he hasn't changed them, that a settlement wasn't possible. So that's where things are at the moment. And the Ukrainians, as I said earlier, have exhibited a capacity in counteroffensive to retake major places and cause the Russians a lot of grief. And so both because they're defending their homeland, and I should add it includes a great many Russian-speaking Ukrainians.
Yes, it does,
But they don't want to be ruled by Putin. They think we're much better off as citizens of Ukraine. Then, all that's, I think, possible in the immediate future is to continue to support Zelensky while cautioning him. Nobody wants a wider war, right? And saying to Putin, you started this war, and only by you accepting that and pulling back at least somewhat is this going to end. And don't even think about using nuclear weapons, because you know that you're outgunned ultimately, and it can't turn out to any good. The big fear, of course, and I used to think this about even Kim Jong-il when he was on his deathbed is,
Yeah.
if you've got a leader like that who arguably has lost perspective and is possibly dying when there are rumors of Putin
Mm-hmm.
being ill,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be a certain fear that he'll say, well, let's exercise the Samson option. Let's pull the
Mm-hmm.
temple down our heads,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Um, because I'm not going to be here. Who gives a pardon the expression, and that's a really worrying thought. The only consoling thought, so to speak, is that so far nobody's done that,
Well,
and people around him are not dying as he is.
yeah.
They don't want to be incinerated, right? So I think we're not in as hairy a situation as given this crisis, but we are seeing something perilously close to a confrontation between uh, NATO and Russia,
Mm.
and we are seeing Putin deeply frustrated, and it would appear, in important respects, from the get-go, deeply deluded. Um, one could have thought he was just lying in saying the things that he did, but why would he expose his own military to such a debacle
Yeah.
um, if he didn't believe what he was telling them?
Yeah, it's very, very clear, and you touched on it earlier, that his own information, that bubble around him, wasn't giving him an accurate picture. And where did that break down? There are all sorts of wonderful analyses that are available online. I will call out one specific channel, Perun, Perun. He's a YouTuber. He works in intelligence and then does YouTubing anonymously on the side under the name Perun. He insists that he only ever uses open source intelligence in his YouTube videos, never discloses anything further than that. That's what he says, but he does a wonderful job of taking what is available in the public sphere and made a compelling case, and I'll link to this particular video in the show notes of this article, that there is corruption all the way up and down the Russian military, to the point that even simple things like the tires on your vehicles are getting old, rubber degrades over time. Every X number of years you need to replace these things or they're not going to survive in battlefield conditions. And instead of putting the new tires on the trucks, the tires arrive and get sold off by the leadership of that unit, off to Belarus or off to some other country that uses the same trucks, and they pocket the money and keep the old tires on their vehicles. And
Yes.
this is happening with ammunition, this is happening with training, this is happening right across the entire military, and may go a long way to actually explaining why the capability gap was so large. My question for you is the same thing happening in China? Because this is something that I have heard but haven't been able to get good data on. Is the Chinese military, massive numbers. The numbers are mind-boggling. But then again, so was the Russian military, and we saw how that played out on the battlefield. Does China have a similar problem?
It's hard to know, and I wouldn't claim to know. But a crucial question, for example, an index of that is the point we made earlier about command and control when it comes to Air Force. So
Mm.
China has greatly increased and modernized its Air Force in
Mm.
the last 2 or 3 decades. No question, it has much better aeroplanes.
Mm-hmm.
And on paper, it looks very formidable. But a real war's not fought on paper. And, we don't know. I don't know, for example, how, leaving aside US intervention, how a battle for air supremacy over the Taiwan Strait would go between Taiwanese fighters,
Mm.
which would be working on American system command and control, and
Mm-hmm.
Chinese fighters, which are in this hyper-centralized, I'm the big man and I call the shots
Yeah.
strategic culture. All
Yeah.
right. Um, by sheer overwhelming numbers, maybe the Chinese
Mm-hmm.
could crush Taiwan, but I wouldn't assume that would happen.
Mm.
And if, of course, the US was involved, then there are many factors to consider. But the most salient is the US has been more or less continually fighting wars, for decades.
Mm.
It's not only got a very substantial military, it's got a practiced one in terms of command and control and the use of platforms, the integration of platforms. China's not fought a war of any kind,
Mm.
we're speaking of, since 1979,
Mm.
when it had a very different army and invaded Vietnam as done, thought to teach it a lesson, and got a very bloody nose because
Yeah.
it was fighting a veteran Vietnamese army, which had just seen off the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So we do have to bear these things in mind. And your point is also very apposite, that there has clearly been a great deal of corruption in China. And although Xi Jinping conducted this huge campaign against corruption, which was much ballyhooed, like many such campaigns in Leninist states, it was as much as anything a pretext to remove political
A
rivals,
political purge. Yeah.
right? And he's surrounded himself, as Putin has, with sycophants. You can't disagree now with Xi
Mm,
Jinping,
mm,
right? And the idea, as I wrote in a newspaper piece some months ago, that you could have a country of 1.4 billion people, which has been greatly modernized economically, and millions of whose citizens have traveled and studied internationally. And they're all supposed to subscribe to the simple-minded nostrums of Xi Jinping thought. It's just an absurdity.
yeah, yeah,
It's absolutely extraordinary in the 21st century. And that's what he's attempting. And a Chinese dissident, now necessarily living abroad, has just published a book called Party of One. And it's about the uber dictatorship of Xi Jinping.
yeah,
Um, so that's digressing a bit from Putin, but we know in Putin's case, that he televised a conversation with his national security staff, which you could see they were all intimidated
mm,
by
mm,
him. They were all trembling to try and put out a form of words that they thought he would find acceptable,
yeah.
and he would humiliate them in person. That's a crazy way to run a country.
And a crazy way to prosecute a war. I mean,
Mm.
that's the idea that let's assume that Putin is a wonderful leader of a great nation. That doesn't make him a good battlefield commander. It's extraordinary to see the level of, as you say, the minutiae, this very centralized command and control type of situation. So, given you mentioned earlier your incredible track record of correctly predicting that Putin would not invade Ukraine, and by the way, I was broadly with you on that as well. And I've been wrong about many things before. These are always they're always probabilistic. They're always I don't think, but then it's always a maybe. It always could. How do
Well, no,
you?
just before we come out with your question, it's worth recalling, and I recalled this with wry amusement, that in 1941, with Hitler's armies poised to invade the Soviet Union,
Mm,
Stalin was told by Zhukov and Timoshenko, his top guys, Hitler's going to invade the Soviet Union. And Stalin said, no, he's not going to do that. And they said, but he's got 3 million men lined up, and we've got agents in Berlin telling us that he's going to do this.
yeah.
And, we've got Zorga in Tokyo telling us that the date, is now known.
Yeah.
And Stalin said that that's all disinformation. He said, think, Hitler's not a complete idiot. He's not going to invade the Soviet Union until he settled accounts with the British Empire. And you'll notice that hasn't been going well. Right?
Yeah.
Well, of course, Stalin had it wrong.
Yeah.
And I realized once Putin had gone to war that lo and behold, not only I, but Zelensky and Macron and, Scholz had made the same mistake.
Mm, mm.
Well, I hadn't been presented with the CIA briefing, which
Sure.
they all had. So I was a little more innocent. But essentially, the mistake was mirror imaging. It was saying, well, we wouldn't do this if we were Putin, therefore Putin won't do it.
Yeah.
It's a very old intelligence area, and Putin did do it. I mean, my wording at the time on TV was Putin's a thug, but he's not stupid. And I said in a recent interview, I'm happy to be correct, but he's stupid.
Yeah, it turns out I got that wrong. So without any fear mongering, I'm sick and tired of the people that want to blow up everything into an impending disaster, etc. Without any fear mongering, what do you believe is the best and most clear-eyed view that we could have of China and the Pacific at the moment? People are warning about war in Taiwan. People are warning about all sorts of things, have been for a long time. I was incorrectly saying 10 years ago that we'd have a war over Taiwan within 5 years, and well, it's 5 years overdue, so come on, Xi Jinping, hurry up. So it's very easy to get caught up in the hype, I guess is what I'm saying. So what would you offer as your best effort at a clear-eyed understanding of China, the situation right now, and the likelihood of any of these sorts of conflicts actually coming to pass?
It's a moving feast, because there are many variables involved, and it repays us always when we're doing an analysis to look for variables that might unsettle what would otherwise be a comfortable prediction.
Sure.
But what people fall into the trap of doing again and again is seeing some salient facts and drawing an inference from them, saying, well, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And they ignore other things that they just don't notice, or that they discount, or they don't keep an eye out for other things emerging that change the picture. So you always have to be prepared to qualify, your judgment. The second thing is that we need to bear in mind that the strategy of the Xi regime, and I think it's fair to say of the Communist Party regime in general, for some time, has been that if at all possible, they want to achieve their goals without fighting. They're not spoiling for a war.
Sure.
They're preparing for a war. They're talking up the danger of a war.
Yeah. as
precisely so
leverage.
that the rest of us will back off and say, oh, no, we don't want a war, right?
Yeah,
Least of all with what appears to be an increasingly and intimidatingly powerful China.
sure.
All right. Um, so the question then becomes, well, as various, I would call them peaceniks in this country say, well, if we do give China that space, if we back off, if we say, oh, the Taiwan's yours, oh, yeah, no worries. Will that avoid a war? No, because if they believe that we're not going to go to war
They
and
will.
Taiwan nevertheless defies them, they'll think, well, we'll take it.
Yeah,
We can win this,
yeah.
right? The alternative is to say to China, you really don't want to do this. There's
Mm,
got to be a way to finesse this with everybody profiting and nobody suffering a disaster.
mm.
And for a long time, that's essentially been the situation. The US said, we have no objection to Taiwan reunifying with China if that's the will of the Taiwanese people, but it needs to be done on that basis and peacefully.
Yeah, yeah.
And we will equip the Taiwanese to defend themselves in case you get too carried away. But China's power has grown and grown.
Mm.
And so the risk that the Chinese leadership will get overconfident or impatient has correspondingly grown and grown. And moreover, we know that the Chinese leadership, the party leadership, have been of the opinion for some time, certainly since the GFC,
Mm.
that the US is in terminal decline. That also, whether it's true or false, as a perception, can trigger miscalculations,
Yeah.
right? And so there's a recent, very well written book called Danger Zone by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley,
Mm.
in which they argue that so far, many pundits have been asserting that China is set to displace the US as the biggest power in the world, and that this is going to take place over decades, and it's all but inevitable. And they said that, in fact, there are many signs that it's far from inevitable, and that beyond 2030, China is going to go into all sorts of tailspins,
Mm-hmm.
demographically, economically, environmentally, politically. But over the next decade, there's a distinct danger that its strategic and military leaders will say, we can see what's coming.
Yeah.
Therefore, we must act in the next few years if we're ever going to get Taiwan back.
Yeah.
And this is why they call the 2020s the danger zone. That's a book people should be reading. And moreover, they, as I had done, if I may say so, they tackle Graham Allison's famous argument that we need to avoid what he calls the Thucydides trap. And if you're familiar with the term, so Thucydides, of course, was the great Greek historian who wrote the Peloponnesian War, the first great work of history.
Right.
And the trap, supposedly, is that a rising power, in the case of the Peloponnesian War, that was Athens,
Right.
gets embroiled in war with the hegemonic power, in that case, Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
Allison's saying, well, we've got a rising power, China, and a hegemonic power, the United States, and there's a danger that this will lead to war because it tends to do that historically. Beckley and Brands point out that it's more complicated than that. It wasn't the case that Athens got embroiled in a war because it, suffering, as it were, from hubris and thought we can beat the Spartans. The Athenians were drawn reluctantly into a war because one of Sparta's allies, Corinth, was about to subdue one of Athens' allies, Corcyra, and if it did, it would then have enough naval power to challenge Athens.
Yeah.
And it's naval power that gave Athens its distinctive clout, right? And so we have to go to the aid of Corcyra. And when they did that, the Spartans said, well, we'll have to back up Corinth, and we're off to the races.
Yeah.
And so it's more interesting, therefore more complex than Allison allowed. And Brands and Beckley are saying that's where we are now, all right? That people are saying, on the face of it, if Taiwan is taken by China, how much difference does that really make? Well, the main difference it would make, at least in the short term, is that the US has backed Taiwan and given it security guarantees for so long that if it either balked at intervening or intervened and lost, the ramifications would be serious because other US allies would say, oh, well, then it won't back us or it can't win.
Yeah.
And we all have to separately scramble to come to terms with Beijing.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We're in that cauldron. We're in that category. And many of our analysts, some good analysts and others, I think people who have basically sold out to Beijing already, have been making that kind of argument, saying we should preemptively seek to come to terms with Beijing because it's going to win.
It is interesting. You quite literally read my mind. The follow-up question I was going to have for you was this demographic time bomb that China has, and this reality that they are faced with a premature peak much earlier than what it would have been had they not made a couple of fundamental mistakes in their command and control country. And much has been written about that, and a lot of good work has been written about that. But you've already kind of answered that question. What then do we make of the Australian situation, though, where we're getting these submarines that won't be online for years, where we are now getting some F-35s, and some more of that is beginning to come through. But given that the acquisition and development timelines on serious weapons systems, the kinds of weapons systems you would need in a general war, in a World War III type scenario, is so long, and we're currently so under-equipped, how do we, if China were to act during this danger zone, how do we get ourselves onto a war-fighting footing in any meaningful sense?
Well, I think it's fair enough to say that most countries, when most wars begin, are not necessarily on a war-fighting footing.
Sure.
But that's not always true, because sometimes there's a lead up to war and everybody's preparing, hoping to deter the other, and it breaks and away we go. To some extent, that was the First World War, right? The Second World War was different because countries, notably Western countries, didn't want a war, and very reluctantly and very late did they even start preparing.
Yeah.
I mean, the French certainly prepared, if you will, for a defensive war, and then they got outflanked. These are all relatively familiar stories. In Australia's case, it seems to me there's several considerations. One is that if we think that the war means being able to defend continental Australia against invasion, then we misunderstand what's likely to happen. Right?
I agree there. Yes, I do.
Right. So what is it precisely we need to be able to do in a war? Well, I would say in any short-term scenario, we would be called upon to act as a loyal US ally.
Sure.
Right. So we've done that in other wars with our existing army. All right. We wouldn't be able to have very much throw weight in such a war, right? No. Because we have small Air Force and Navy.
Yeah.
But that's what we'd be asked to do. And the reason that the big deal has been set up with AUKUS, which includes submarines and various other lines of equipment and platforms, is twofold. One is because we've decided, well, we've got to reframe our strategic thinking, but also because I think there's a settled assumption which has not taken note of the argument, for example, of Brands and Beckley, that it's the long haul. It's for decades now we've got this problem, right? If you took their argument seriously and said, well, beyond 2030, there could be contingencies that would be discomforting, but it's the next 7 or 8 years that are really worrying.
Is the primary danger.
Right. Then we're clearly not going to have the nuclear submarines in that time frame. But we wouldn't have had the new conventional submarines in that time frame either.
No,
so
true.
That's really not an objection to having the nuclear submarines in, right? It's a separate argument. And the people who are saying that why are we getting nuclear submarines because we won't have them in time are the very people who say we shouldn't be fighting anyway, whether we had them or not.
And this argument, the counter to my own argument would be if people hadn't kept putting it off in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, then we would have the equipment now. It's only because we keep saying, oh, but it won't be here in time, that it's not there on that next generation. It's a perpetual argument.
I don't know if you and I have had this conversation, but about a decade or so ago, it's about right, I think, I ran a series of workshops for the Submarine Institute on this very question. What kind of submarines does Australia need? And the submariners made very clear that if they had their druthers, then the Virginia-class SSN would be the best submarine, no question at all, for Australia. And they explained why. But they said that's not going to happen. The US won't sell them, and we don't have a nuclear industry, and our government will never buy into this. And so put that off the table. There's no use in arguing for that because it's just not going to happen. What we do need to do is make the case that Australia needs long-range submarines because there's a widespread misunderstanding as to what submarines are for and why Australia needs long-range submarines. And so we developed that argument. And the submarine project expressed interest in having me map the bigger case, right, in terms of what kind of sub. Now, that would have been a price piece of work to do. But they balked in the end at engaging my services or my company services. And And I was finally directed to talk to the Deputy Secretary of Defence for Strategy, the late Brendan Sargent, who said to me behind closed doors, just the two of us in his office, you need to understand that no one involved in this decision has any interest in transparency.
Yeah.
No one.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that's remarkably candid, but we can see the results, right? There's a great deal of disquiet, of misunderstanding and polemic because this decision, A, was delayed, B, it was changed about 3 times, right?
Yes.
And C, it remains controversial, right? Would that have been the case had we been able to run effective workshops early and get people on board behind a clear argument? I'd like to think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there were politicians, there were bureaucrats, there were different arms of the defence services, there were industry lobbies, there were foreign lobbies, and nobody had an interest in transparency. And that's, one could say that's the way the world goes, but that's how we landed with this decision. Then, of course, when I say this decision, the decision, Tony Abbott says, Captain's call, we'll get the Japanese subs. And then Turnbull says, no, we won't, we'll do the French one.
Yep.
And
then we're not.
Morrison says, no, we're going to go with the SSNs.
Yeah.
How does all that play? All I can say is that I know, as perhaps most of the public wouldn't, that the submariners were clear from the get-go. If we could get the Virginia-class subs, absolutely, that's what we would go for.
Yeah.
And then they became available. The Morrison government was persuaded, all right, then, let's do this when we can.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Monk, this has been such a thrill, such a pleasure. I do appreciate you just downloading so much of your experience and knowledge on all of these topics. I am going to have to call it there, but thank you so much. Congratulations again. You continue to do great work reviewing other people's work and advising people on all of these sorts of complex issues, and we have the absolute pleasure and privilege of having you occasionally here on the Aussie Wire. So thank you once again.
Thanks, Topher. Great pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire. That was Dr. Paul Monk. Now, he's just released an update to his book, Thunder from the Silent Zone. It became available for online purchase literally only yesterday and is mandatory reading for anyone who wants to understand what's happening in China now. The original version was published in 2005 and proved to be prescient, almost prophetic, in its outlook on China. And this update brings the book up to date with a clear-eyed and deeply researched look at where China is heading in the coming decade. Link is, of course, in the description. The Aussie Wire release new videos every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up with past episodes at theaussiewire.com and be sure to join our email list at theaussiewire.com so you don't miss a thing. Thank you for watching. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.